Professor Nick Ryder, why do you think white-collar crime was a contributory factor in the 2008 financial crisis?
I think there's a number of reasons why it's a factor for the most recent financial crisis. If you look back at history, you'll find lots of illustrations of financial crises and white-collar crime. So, for example, some people have argued that the Great Depression was partly caused by fraud and Ponzi schemes by Charles Ponzi in Boston and Florida. But if you look at the traditional factors behind the financial crisis, most people will say weak banking regulation, weak banking laws, ineffective macroeconomic policy. But from what my research has indicated is that there are 6 or 7 different examples of white-collar crime which have contributed towards the financial crisis.
What might they be?
Well, the first and obvious example will be a subprime loan, and it's linked into mortgage fraud. So a subprime loan is where the lender will deliberately target a high-risk debtor. So in many cases, the debtor will be given a mortgage by a financial institution and they simply cannot afford to repay it. There's allegations that in itself amounts to what they call predatory lending, whereby the borrower deliberately targets at-risk individuals who simply haven't got the financial means to make the monthly repayments. And then there's allegations of how that links into mortgage fraud. Research by the FBI suggests that since 2006, mortgage fraud has increased from $400 million to approximately $14 billion in 2013. And other research to support that contention is with the FBI, who have secured over 1,100 prosecutions since 2008 in relation to mortgage fraud, allegations of mortgage fraud.
Are those figures for the US or worldwide?
They are for the US. Figures for the UK would suggest an increase of mortgage fraud in excess of £1 billion for 2013-14. And again, we're seeing increased enforcement activities by the Financial Conduct Authority in terms of banning traders who have breached their own regulations, and more prosecutions by the Cease Fraud Office in relation to this area as well.
Apart from mortgage crime, what other examples of white-collar crime are there?
One of the other examples you could refer to is a Ponzi fraud. A Ponzi fraud, in the simplest definition, is a pyramid fraud. So whereby you induce investors into a fraudulent scam, and the more investors you get, the people at the top end of the pyramid get paid their dividends back. But the lower down the pyramid, of course, people will lose their scams. 2 of the high-profile examples in the financial crisis are Bernard Madoff and Alan Stanford. Of course, Mr. Madoff is currently serving 150 years imprisonment for 13 convictions of wire fraud and mortgage fraud, and Alan Stanford 108 years for an $8 billion scam. And the enforcement activities again of the FBI and the SEC illustrate a significant increase in their enforcement activities and sanctions they've imposed since the last crisis in 2008.
So for those, then white-collar crime doesn't pay?
Well, there's an argument that it does pay because the SEC will only impose financial sanctions. They're unable to bring any criminal proceedings, so therefore they must defer those cases to the Department of Justice, and they will then only investigate 1 in 10 allegations of referred by the SEC.
That brings me on then to ask you, what do you think of the legislative and policy responses so far towards white-collar crime?
I think the US is a step ahead of the UK. One of the first measures introduced by Barack Obama was to grant the FBI additional funding of $350 million to combat mortgage fraud that arose from the financial crisis. So there's recognition by Barack Obama's administration that white-collar crime was a key factor in the financial crisis. In contrast to the UK, it's very bitty, very ad hoc. What we've seen are knee-jerk reactions by the coalition government. So, for example, we've recently had the Financial Services Banking Reform Act, which criminalises conduct of bankers whose incompetence can lead to a bank collapsing. But of course, how many banks have collapsed in the last 10 years in the UK? They've all been bailed out by the taxpayer. So the British government's policy has been to seek to impose financial sanctions, and 2013-14 the FCA has imposed sanctions in excess of £340 million as opposed to prosecutions, and the first one was only secured yesterday, where we have, according to the SFO's press release, a senior banker has been convicted of conspiracy to defraud, but for legal reasons his name can't be mentioned as of today.
So until yesterday, which was the 6th of October 2014, there have been a limited number of prosecutions.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
There's a number of factors. One of the main factors in the UK is austerity measures introduced by the coalition government, the Serious Fraud Office, its budget has been slashed since 2010. So I think for this year it's approximately £30 million. So how can you expect the SFO to prosecute allegations of fraud with that industries in excess of £50 billion per year? So that's one factor. The other factor is a weak legislative framework. So previously prosecutions could have been brought by the regulatory body, but they were uncertain as to the true extent of their powers. So for example, the FSA have admitted they can't prosecute for fraud, yet case law suggests they can under the Banking Act 1979 section 35. So it appears they're not really sure of their own enforcement powers.
Yes, so we have a few issues to be ironed out there.
A couple, yes.
What reforms would you recommend then should be made to ensure this is more effective?
I think there's two measures of reforms you could introduce. I think the first reform would be the creation of a single economic crime agency, where you would see the merger of several agencies, like HM Revenue Customs, the Serious Fraud Office, the regulatory body, all into one pure agency that's dedicated to tackle financial crime. And I think the other possible avenue would be more funding. So if you compare Barack Obama's additional funding for the FBI, more prosecutions, more sanctions, in the UK the government actually cut funding, so it limits the ability of the SFO to secure these high-profile prosecutions they need.
Should this be done on a UK basis or an EU basis?
I think primarily from initially a UK perspective, obviously the City of London is regarded as one of the global financial epicenters in terms of transactions and trade. Within the European Union it's a little bit more difficult because the EU has yet again a rather fragmented approach towards financial crime legislation. So for example, it has several bits of money laundering, but no policy for fraud. Yet it has a policy for terrorist financing and market manipulation, but not for fraud, which is unusual.
Professor Ryder, thank you very much.
Thank you.